Hello, it's Simone. I'm so glad you are here with me today for another up close and personal look at the ink Sailor Shikiori Yozakura. I have already added this ink sample into my ink journal, and the only, in air quotes, thing that I'm doing right now is I'm going to add longer writing samples because I have found that I can't really see how the ink performs in different nib sizes or nib widths with the minimal writing that I have done. And so I've decided to go back and fill in the samples that I have already made, as given if I still have the ink. I mostly use ink samples, so some are empty and it's just not going to happen. But those that I still have ink, or especially those that still have ink bottles, where I definitely have enough ink to do that, I will fill in the blank spaces. And when I'm making a new ink entry into this ink journal, then I will add the writing sample right away. In this ink journal, I have a video on my channel where I talk about what I'm doing here and what it is exactly about. Basically, I'm making an ink splotch, I'm doing an ink chromatography, a water test, I'm layering the ink several times, I'm adding in a sample from, not a sample, an affirmation from an affirmation deck that I have, just because I like those. And then that's the first spread, so I'm using 4 pages in a Hobonichi planner. That's what goes on the right side. On the left side, I'm adding the writing samples. And then on the next 2 pages that you see here, the ink bleeds through from where I make the ink splotch, so I don't have a lot of room and I don't really want to use this page. So the only thing I write is, do I have a sample or a bottle of this, and when did I get either one and where from? And then on the next page on the right side, if I ink a fountain pen with this ink, then I'll just add a writing sample with this specific pen and nib, so that when I have this ink in multiple pens and nib sizes, I can refer back to this page later and see exactly how this ink looks in multiple different pens. So one other thing that I usually have in my whole nerdy ink collection sample swatching thingy going on is I usually sample the ink on these coloring cards and also on the Tsubame ink cards. If they still, I got those from Yoseka Stationery. If they still have them there, I will link them in the description box below. So Sailor Shikiori Yozakura is an ink from Sailor, and the Shikiori line is a bigger line from Sailor, where the meaning of Shikiori, if I got that correctly, is season, and Sailor is looking or creating colors that look at the seasons from various different angles. And so Yozakura means the evening cherry blossom, and it is definitely, I think they got that name really, the color and the name match up really nicely. So it is a very muted purple. I purchased that ink last year, so in maybe May, so the month I'm not so sure about, but 2021, this is 2022. I purchased it a year ago, and I had it in a fountain pen, and it did not really work well for me. I think the pen was a very dry writer to begin with, and then I had it in a nib that was way too fine, and so I barely was able to recognize what I had written on the page. I have since acquired a double broad nib in a Kaweco Sport, and I wanted to use that ink in this pen again just to see how the ink would perform differently. And I can tell you it's definitely worth using a broader nib for this ink because it's absolutely beautiful. The shading is chef's kiss, and so I can clearly say that yes, it works in finer nibs, but it shines in the broader nibs. Most of the inks do, actually. You saw me before, like prepping all of those things. For some reason, I have started to remove the nibs and feeds, especially with the TWSBI nibs, when I'm cleaning them, and then I let them dry, and then I just put all the feeds and nibs into this Altoids tin and put the fountain pens away, and then when I use them, I just put them together as I like it, as I see fit. So I can swap the color of the pen and the nib. They don't really matter which one goes on which fountain pen. But instead of inking up the whole pen, I'm just dipping the pen in the ink, and that usually saturates the feed enough to be able to provide this writing sample. And so I think I'm writing 6 lines with the finer nibs. So this is an extra fine nib. This is the only extra fine nib that I have. So I can't really compare extra fine across different brands. They do have differences for sure, but the only extra fine nib that I have is a TWSBI. And then I'm using the dip pen, and you can already see how much more ink the dip pen carries, and it doesn't dispense the ink as controlled as a fountain pen would do with a feed. So when I dip it into the ink, it's definitely a lot wetter and more saturated, and then while I'm writing it fades away. Well, not in this writing sample. So I have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to talk about when I'm actually when do I use my fountain pens? When do you use your fountain pens? Please let me know in the comments below, because sometimes fountain pens aren't the best thing to use, but how I am using them is I use in my long form writing. So especially when I'm writing longer things over longer periods of time, I make sure to use a fountain pen, because I find that when the girth of the section is wide enough, my hand does not fatigue as much as with especially gel pen, which is very interesting, or a ballpoint pen. I actually noticed that in my arm and shoulder, everything tenses up, and so the fountain pen helps with that. So every time I'm writing over a long period of time, that's when I use it. So in my long form writing journal, when I write letters, in my project notebooks, like in my YouTube journal. Basically, when I'm writing a lot in one sitting, then I'm using a fountain pen. I have started to use it in my weekly creative journal, but not on a general basis. And then when I'm not using it is in my planner, when I jot down a note there and I then close the book again really quickly, then the chances of the ink smudging is too much for me. In a lot of my other journals, I don't use it. I don't use it in everyday life when I make a list or something in my house, or I also don't use fountain pens at work or for short writing sessions. Then I usually use whatever pen I can find, and usually it's not a fountain pen, because I really don't enjoy writing with a fountain pen on a paper that is not very suited for fountain pens. Let me know when you use them. Do you purchase specific paper for using them, the fountain pens? How do you deal with that? I would love to hear in the comments below. Let's chat about it. How do you like this ink? Do you use this ink? What's your experience? What's your favorite nib and fountain pen to use with this ink? I'd love to know in the comments below. And I'm still not done. So this exactly is the Kaweco double broad, and you can see how amazing it writes with this ink. Best writing experience ever. So the only thing that you need to remember when you use a double broad nib is to ink up your cartridge completely, because it uses a heck of a lot of ink. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments in the comments below. Where else? You can find me on Instagram, on Ko-fi, where I share mostly about my year of making. I do have subscriptions, but you can also follow me there without any financial commitment if that interests you. Goodbye.